They did not come back for the satellites because they wanted them. They came back because throwing something away is supposed to be the end of the story, and for the first time in 200 years, it wasn't. The Centauri hegemony had catalogued every human weapon system, every fleet exercise, every border skirmish down to the serial number for 2 centuries. What they never catalogued, because they never thought to, was a network of 41 aging cultural exchange satellites that had spent 30 years quietly broadcasting Earth's music into the dark. The hegemony called them Array 9, obsolete broadcast infrastructure, non-functional category, return to origin. Humanity called them the songlines. Nobody outside a small, underfunded lab in Reykjavik had called them anything for years. The return manifest arrived on a Tuesday, translated by the hegemony's own diplomatic corps into English that was better than most native speakers could manage. It read in part, "This transfer constitutes the disposal of non-strategic cultural debris. No treaty obligations attach. No further contact regarding this material is anticipated or required." 41 satellites powered down, stripped of anything the hegemony's threat assessment division considered worth stripping, dropped back into Earth orbit like a landlord leaving old furniture on the curb. Second Speaker Ovanrai delivered the notification personally, which was itself a small cruelty dressed as courtesy. He appeared on every major broadcast channel at once, in the smooth gray robes of the diplomatic corps, and smiled the particular Centauri smile that took decades of study to read as anything other than warmth. "We return what is yours," he said, "with the hope that it brings your people some comfort. In another few centuries you might understand why we no longer required it." He did not say harmless, he did not have to. The room at the Institute for Comparative Signals went quiet the way rooms go quiet when everyone is doing the math on how insulted they are allowed to be. Then Dr. Amara Voss said, "I want the manifests." And nobody in the room was surprised, because Amara Voss had been saying some version of that sentence for 11 years. Voss ran the Institute's smallest and most ridiculed department. Comparative acoustic mathematics, 3 people and a server rack, funded mostly out of a line item nobody had bothered to cut. Her doctoral thesis, written before first contact was even a rumor, had argued that human musical notation was a compression format dense enough to encode information no spoken language could carry efficiently. 2 review boards had called it interesting but not fundable. A third had called it, in writing, a solution in search of a problem. Voss kept that letter framed on her office wall not out of bitterness, but because being right early is a kind of debt you collect on later, and she intended to collect. When the songlines came back, she didn't see garbage. She saw 41 instruments the hegemony had returned without bothering to ask what they were actually for. They stripped what they thought was sensitive, she told her director, over a phone call at 11 at night that she did not apologize for. "I'm interested in everything else." It was, on its face, a scientist's line and nothing more. It took the rest of the department 3 weeks to understand it as the reframe it actually was. The recovery team that boarded the first return satellite consisted of 4 people, and every one of them had been professionally embarrassed for being right too early. Dr. Priya Ashworth, signals engineer, had spent 6 years arguing that the songline's uplink logs were being routed through a longer, stranger path than anyone admitted, and had been quietly removed from 2 budget meetings for raising it. Dr. Teodor Marchetti, materials scientist twice divorced, once nearly deported over a paperwork error that had nothing to do with any of this, a detail he brought up unprompted and often, had published a paper arguing that the satellite's housing alloy showed crystalline behavior that shouldn't have been possible for a decades-old broadcast platform, and had been laughed out of a conference in Geneva for it. Dr. Kwame Osai, defense physicist, had once submitted an internal memo suggesting that acoustic and electromagnetic resonance may share exploitable mathematical structure, and had received in reply a single line. "Please stop." Ashworth found it first in the relay logs 4 days into the recovery. She stopped scrolling because her hands stopped wanting to move. "These satellites haven't been relaying our broadcasts for the last 6 years, she said quietly, to a room that had learned to go quiet when she used that tone. "They've been relaying theirs." The explanation came slower than the reaction, the way it always did with her. The Centauri border fleet, it turned out, had been using Array 9 as an unlisted relay node for low-priority internal traffic, because the satellites were old, unencrypted by hegemony standards and beneath notice. Nobody at the hegemony had thought to scrub 6 years of their own low-clearance shield calibration traffic before shipping the hardware back to the species it belonged to. "They used our garbage as a filing cabinet," Ashworth said, "and then they gave us the filing cabinet back." Marchetti's discovery came a week later, in the materials lab, and it started with him going very still in front of a diffraction scan instead of saying anything at all. "This housing isn't Earth alloy," he said eventually. "It's not even close to Earth alloy. It's a resonance-tuned lattice, the same crystalline family as Centauri shield plating, and it's been sitting in orbit around our planet for 30 years wearing a coat of paint that says decommissioned broadcast satellite. He sat down on the lab floor because his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him up, which was, for a man who had once argued with a review board for 4 hours without sitting down, its own kind of confession. Osai's discovery took the longest, because it required Ashworth's relay logs and Marchetti's lattice data to already exist before it made any sense. He found it at 2 in the morning, and he did not call anyone. He drove to the lab in person because some things deserve to be said to a face. Their shields aren't electromagnetic, he said. Not primarily, they're harmonic. The lattice holds its integrity through a resonance field, and the calibration data sitting in our relay logs is the tuning schema for that field. He put both hands flat on the table, the way a man does when he needs something solid to be true. Every Centauri warship built on this hull family is running a resonance signature we now have 6 years of calibration history for. Voss, who had been quiet through all 3 discoveries, the way a conductor is quiet before the downbeat, finally spoke. Music is organized resonance, she said. We've spent 30 years accidentally teaching a species that communicates and shields itself with harmonic fields exactly how human harmonic structure behaves under stress, decay, and interference. Because we were sending them symphonies and folk songs, and none of us, including them, thought a Chopin nocturne was a weapons-grade waveform. Nobody in the room laughed because it wasn't funny yet. It would be funny later, in the specific way this channel's viewers had come to expect, but not yet. The hegemony's mistake, once you saw it, was almost embarrassingly specific. For 200 years, their threat assessment division had studied human weapons with obsessive, meticulous, genuinely respectable rigor. They had modeled human fleet doctrine, human materials science, human command structure, down to a level of detail that made Earth's own defense analysts uncomfortable. What they had never modeled was human art, because art to the hegemony was decoration, a gesture, a thing species did while waiting to become serious. They had watched humanity's weapons for 2 centuries and never once asked why humanity also spent its scarce resources broadcasting orchestras into the void, because the question never occurred to them as a question worth asking. It was, Voss thought, the same mistake a burglar makes when he checks every lock on the front door and walks straight past the greenhouse, because a greenhouse isn't where anyone keeps anything worth stealing. Except the greenhouse, in this case, had 30 years of load-bearing structural notes on the burglar's own house. The hegemony noticed something was wrong before the recovery team was ready for them to notice. It started as a formal inquiry, polite and clipped, regarding unusual resonance activity detected from Earth's orbital debris. It ended 4 days later as an ultimatum delivered in the same devastating bureaucratic register the hegemony used for everything it considered beneath a raised voice. Any attempt to reverse engineer hegemony architecture from decommissioned materials constitutes a breach of the non-interference accord. You are given 48 hours to surrender the array and all derived data. Failure to comply will be considered an act requiring correction. Voss read it twice, standing in the lab, and felt the specific, quiet vertigo of a deadline landing on a problem she had already half-solved. They didn't come back because they think we're dangerous, she said. They came back because they think we're finally worth threatening properly, and that's not the same thing yet. She did not raise her voice because raising her voice had never once made an equation true faster. We have 48 hours to become the thing they're already afraid of. The acceleration that followed did not look like fear from the outside. It looked like 4 people not sleeping, a lab full of borrowed hardware, and a defense department suddenly very interested in a discipline it had spent a decade underfunding. Osai modeled the resonance decay curves. Marchetti confirmed the lattice tolerances of every known Centauri hull class, cross-referenced against 6 years of stolen calibration data. Ashworth rebuilt the relay array's transmission capacity from scratch, in 4 days, using hardware that was never designed to carry a signal this precise. Voss wrote the composition. She called it, in her notes, Movement for 41 Instruments, and refused to explain the title to anyone who asked, because she had decided a long time ago that some jokes were only for her. The hegemony flotilla arrived 9 hours before the deadline expired, which was its own message. They weren't waiting for humanity to fail to comply, they were arriving early enough to make compliance feel optional. 6 cruisers, standard border enforcement configuration, holding position at the edge of geostationary orbit. Second speaker Ovan Rai's final transmission before the deadline was, notably, not a threat. It was a correction of tone, delivered with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing to a slow student. This need not become an incident, he said. Return what is not yours to keep and we will forget this happened. The deadline expired at 04:12 UTC. Nobody on the human side sent a reply. Voss's composition began broadcasting at 04, 12 and 11 seconds. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The 6 cruisers held their resonance shields at standard calibration, because standard calibration had never once failed them in 200 years of enforcement actions. The songlines, all 41 of them, broadcast Voss's composition across the exact harmonic band the shields were tuned to, layered with the decay pattern OSI had modeled from 6 years of the hegemony's own maintenance logs. The shields did not shatter. They did something worse from a Centauri engineer's perspective. They held technically while losing coherent structure, the way a bridge can remain standing while every load calculation underneath it stops being true. 2 cruisers lost primary shielding within 90 seconds and broke formation. One attempted a targeted counter-resonance pulse, a response that was, OSI would later admit, genuinely clever, the first correct instinct anyone on the Centauri side had all night. And for 11 seconds it worked, stabilizing the lattice on 2 of the remaining ships. Then Voss's composition shifted key, a modulation she had built in specifically for this, and the counterpulse became one more input the shields had to reconcile instead of a fix. A 4th cruiser powered down its resonance field entirely rather than let it fail uncontrolled, which was, functionally, a surrender. The 5th held position, badly, weapons still armed, until OSI's team rooted a narrow burst directly at its exposed lattice seams and it went dark. The 6th reversed thrust and withdrew past the debris field without firing a shot, and nobody on the human side pursued it, because Voss had asked specifically that whoever ran be allowed to. Let that one go, she said, watching the tactical display. Somebody needs to go home and explain this honestly. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, no human casualties. No wreckage that hadn't already surrendered its structural integrity on its own terms. Second speaker, Ovunrai's official transmission arrived 4 hours later, and it was exactly what everyone expected. Correct, careful, and empty. A formal acknowledgement of unanticipated technical developments that committed the hegemony to nothing. His personal transmission arrived 2 hours after that, unscheduled, unlisted, sent from a private channel nobody on the human side had given out. There was a long pause before he spoke, long enough that Voss, watching the feed, thought the connection had dropped. I have spent 2 centuries studying what your species could build to hurt us, he said finally. I did not think to study what you built to move each other. That was, I understand now, audacious of you, though I do not think you intended it as audacity at the time. Another pause. I was wrong about what a species is when it is not yet done deciding what it wants to be. I do not think I will be given the chance to be the one who corrects that mistake for my government. I wanted to say it to someone before that stopped mattering. He did not apologize exactly. Centauri diplomatic language Voss had learned didn't have a clean word for it, but it was close enough that nobody in the lab corrected him. By the time the formal negotiations began, 3 days later, Voss was no longer in the room where the treaty language was being drafted. She was in her lab with Ashworth, going through 6 years of relay data with the specific, unhurried focus of someone who has already won the argument and is now doing the actual work. They're going to want the harmonic architecture, Ashworth said. Full technical exchange, not just the calibration logs we already have. We cracked 40% of their shield mathematics ourselves in 6 days, with borrowed hardware and no sleep, Voss said. With the actual protocols instead of what fell out of their trash, we'll have full parity in under a year, maybe less. She did not say this like a victory speech. She said it the way she said everything, like a fact that had simply finished arriving. Someone from the negotiating team called to ask if she wanted to be there for the signing. No, she said. I want the next set of relay frequencies they're willing to share. There's a modulation pattern in their long-range communications I haven't finished mapping yet, and I'd like to start before they change their minds about how much they're willing to let us learn. She was still at her desk, 40 minutes later, half a page into notes for a piece she wasn't calling anything yet. When the treaty signing appeared muted on a screen nobody in the lab was watching. Nobody in the lab was watching.